Joseph Stalin trusted no one. He executed his own generals. He signed death lists for his closest friends. He had his own relatives shot. And yet, in his entire life, there was exactly one man he chose to believe: Adolf Hitler. In August 1939, Stalin raised a glass in the Kremlin and toasted Hitler's health. And he meant it. For 22 months, he ignored more than 80 separate warnings that Hitler was coming for him, because he refused to believe his one trusted partner would lie. That single act of trust helped make the Soviet Union unprepared for the invasion that followed and cost it 27 million lives. Verdict 1. Admiration. What did Stalin think of Hitler? Most people assume the answer is hatred. Two opposite ideologies, two mortal enemies, locked in the bloodiest war in human history. That answer is wrong, at least at the start, because the first thing Joseph Stalin ever felt about Adolf Hitler was not fear, and it was not hatred. It was professional respect. June 19, 1934. Hitler has been in power barely 18 months, and he turns on his own movement. Over a single weekend, the leadership of the SA, the stormtroopers who put him in power, is arrested and shot. Ernst Röhm, his oldest comrade, killed in a prison cell. Dozens dead without trial, without law, in the open. Europe reacted with alarm. Newspapers called it a descent into gangsterism. And in Moscow, Stalin's reaction, recorded by those who were there, was admiration. He is reported to have remarked that Hitler was a great fellow, that this was how you dealt with your political opponents. Understand precisely what he was praising, not the ideology. Stalin had no interest in Nazi racial theory. He found it primitive. What impressed him was the technique. Here was a leader who had solved the oldest problem in dictatorship, the ambitious friend who helped you climb, by simply killing him, quickly, and surviving the aftermath politically intact. 3 years later, Stalin ran the same experiment on a vastly larger scale. The Great Purge consumed his own party, his own officer corps, his own intimates. Where Hitler had killed dozens, Stalin killed hundreds of thousands. Two dictators, watching each other's methods across a continent, taking notes. And here is the flaw that would eventually cost 27 million lives. Admiration is not a neutral emotion. When you respect a man's methods, you start assuming he calculates the way you do. Stalin had begun building a model of Hitler in his head. He assumed Hitler was a rational player, calculating, cynical, predictable. He was wrong in exactly one place, the place that mattered. Verdict 2. The toast. Here's a myth that survives to this day, that Stalin was forced into a deal with Hitler, that the Western powers left him no choice, that he signed reluctantly, holding his nose. The truth is colder. Stalin didn't just sign that deal. He raised a glass and drank to Adolf Hitler's health. It happened past midnight on August 23, 1939, in the Kremlin, and the world woke up the next morning, genuinely unable to believe it. Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union had been mortal enemies for 6 years, ideologically, militarily, and rhetorically opposed. Their pact, in 1939, shocked the world, as the two most committed enemies on earth suddenly became allies. And now their foreign ministers, Molotov and Ribbentrop, sat in a Kremlin room, signing a non-aggression pact. Attached to the pact was a secret protocol dividing Eastern Europe between the two powers. Poland carved in half, the Baltics and Finland assigned to the Soviet sphere. Two dictators, on one sheet of paper, decided the fate of tens of millions without their consent. 9 days later, Hitler invaded Poland. 2 weeks after that, Stalin invaded from the east and took his share. The Second World War had begun, and it began with these two men as partners. Then came the toast. Stalin lifted his glass to the German delegation and drank to the health of Adolf Hitler, telling them he knew how much the German people loved their Führer. He wasn't being sarcastic. Ribbentrop went home describing the Kremlin as feeling like being among old comrades. So why did Stalin think he'd won? 3 reasons. And from Stalin's perspective, they were all perfectly rational. First, territory. Without firing a shot, he had reclaimed the lands lost after the First World War. Second, time. Years, he believed, to rebuild the Red Army he had just decapitated in his own purge. Third, the capitalist powers. Germany would now bleed Britain and France white in the West. The Soviet Union would watch, armed, and wait. On paper, it was brilliant. Stalin thought he had outplayed everyone. And then comes the detail that tells you how completely he believed it, the one most people have never heard. The pact came with a trade agreement. And for the next 22 months, Soviet trains ran west into Germany carrying grain, oil, manganese, cotton, and rubber, raw materials feeding the German war machine while it conquered Europe. Those shipments continued right into the final hours. On the night of June 21, 1941, Soviet freight trains were still rolling across the border into German territory. A few hours later, the German army used the fuel in its tanks to invade the country that had sold it. Verdict 3. The warnings he burned. The myth here is the most forgiving one, and the most wrong. People assume Stalin was simply caught off guard, that German secrecy was too good, that nobody saw it coming, that the invasion was a genuine surprise. The opposite is true. Stalin may have been the single best informed man in Europe about what was about to happen to him. More than 80 separate warnings reached his desk. 80. From different countries, different agencies, different kinds of sources, all pointing at the same conclusion: Hitler is coming. Here are the ones that should have been impossible to ignore. In April 1941, Churchill personally warned Stalin that German armored divisions were moving east, based on intercepted communications British intelligence had been reading. The British Prime Minister wrote directly to Moscow, "They are coming for you." Stalin's read, a trick. He was convinced Churchill's real goal was to drag the Soviet Union into war with Germany to relieve pressure on Britain. The warning wasn't intelligence, it was manipulation. Richard Sword, a German communist spy embedded in the Tokyo embassy, read the ambassador's telegrams and sent Stalin the buildup, scale, and timing of the attack. The invasion would come in the second half of June. He was one of the most valuable spies of the 20th century, and Stalin's own agent. Stalin dismissed him. Sorg, in Moscow's judgment, was too close to the Germans to be trusted. The deserters. In the final days, individual German soldiers, men who could not stomach what was about to happen, risked everything to cross the line and warn the Red Army. One swam a river to do it. Stalin's order regarding such men was to treat them as provocateurs, sources of disinformation designed to trick the Soviet Union into mobilizing first. Some were shot. And then, the document that captures the whole catastrophe in a single scribble. On June 17, 1941, 5 days before the invasion, Soviet intelligence gave Stalin a report from an agent inside the German Air Ministry confirming the attack was imminent, but Stalin dismissed the source as a British provocateur. The most paranoid man on earth refused to see the one conspiracy that was actually real. Stalin projected his own strategic logic onto Hitler. No rational leader would open a second front while Britain remained undefeated. It would be suicide. Therefore, any report claiming otherwise had to be a provocation, and he dismissed warnings from Churchill, Sorge, and his own intelligence. He wasn't blind, he was reasoning, carefully, coldly, and from a false premise. The mirror had become a blindfold. At 3:15 a.m. on June 22, 1941, 3 million German troops crossed a 1,000-mile border in the largest invasion in military history. Some Soviet border units were reportedly ordered not to return fire because it might be a provocation. The man who trusted nobody had trusted exactly once, and it was already too late to take it back. Verdict 4. Hatred and the son he refused to save. There's a story people love to tell about this moment, that Stalin had a complete nervous breakdown when the invasion came, that he collapsed, hid for days, and abandoned his country in its worst hour. The truth is more interesting and more damning. Stalin didn't collapse immediately. He kept working. What broke him came a week later, and it wasn't fear. It was the realization that he had been outsmarted. Follow the sequence, because the psychology is the whole story. For 2 days after the invasion, Stalin went silent, leaving Moscow for his dacha and effectively ceasing to govern. When his Politburo found him, he reportedly assumed they had come to arrest him, muttering that they had squandered Lenin's inheritance. They had not come to arrest him. They had come to beg him to lead. And when Stalin realized that, something switched back on. On July 3, 1941, 11 days into the invasion, Stalin finally spoke to his people on the radio, and he opened with words he had never used before in his life. Brothers and sisters, my friends. Stalin, who usually addressed the nation as comrades, now called them brothers and sisters, reaching past ideology for something older. From that day on, his hatred for Hitler was total and personal, driving the Soviet Union all the way to Berlin. But hatred in a man like Stalin does not look like grief or rage. It looks like this: the personal wound that turned strategy into hatred. On July 16, 1941, 3.5 weeks into the war, the Germans captured a Soviet artillery lieutenant near Vitskas. His papers identified him as Yakov Chugashvili. Chugashvili was Stalin's real family name. The man in German custody was Stalin's eldest son. German propaganda dropped leaflets over Soviet lines featuring Yakov's photograph, the captured son of Stalin, with the message, "Even the leader's own son has surrendered." It was a calculated attempt to break morale, but it failed to fracture Soviet resolve. Now understand who Yakov actually was, because his life explains the ending. Yakov, Stalin's son from his first marriage, endured a cold, contemptuous relationship with his father, once mocked after a suicide attempt. At war, he refused special treatment and went to the front as an ordinary officer, trying in vain to earn the approval he was never given. And when Stalin learned that his son had been captured alive, here was his response. He had Yakov's wife arrested. Yulia Meltzer was taken into custody, imprisoned for roughly 2 years. Her offense? Being married to a man who had been captured. Under Stalin's own decree, surrender was treason, and the families of traitors were subject to arrest. Stalin applied his own law to his own daughter-in-law. Her small child was left without her. That is the temperature of the man we're dealing with. His son had been taken, and the first move was punishment inside the family. Then, after Stalingrad in early 1943, came the moment that has defined this story ever since. The Germans had lost Field Marshal Friedrich Paulus, the commander of the 6th Army, into Soviet captivity. An offer was floated: trade Paulus for Yakov, a field marshal for a lieutenant. Stalin refused. The line attributed to him has echoed for 80 years. "I will not exchange a marshal for a lieutenant." Stalin refused to trade for his son Yakov, reasoning that millions of Soviet families had sons in German camps with no leader to bargain for them. To buy his own son's freedom would be to admit his blood was worth more than theirs, and to confirm that surrender could have a price. So he let him stay. Yakov died at Sachsenhausen concentration camp on April 14, 1943. The accounts describe a man who had stopped waiting. He walked out of his barracks toward the camp's electrified perimeter fence, ignored the guard's order to stop, and was shot. The son of the most powerful man in Russia died alone in a German camp because his father would not bargain for him. And the story does not end cleanly there, which is the part that stays with you. Yakov's daughter Galina grew up under the weight of Stalin's legacy and spent her life defending his memory, insisting on a kinder version of the man who let her father die. To live inside a name that enormous, you either break it or defend it. She chose to defend it. Her aunt would make the opposite choice and take it all the way across the world, but that comes later. For now, hold the balance sheet of this section. Stalin's verdict on Hitler had completed its journey. Admiration, then trust, then a hatred so absolute it would not stop until Soviet soldiers stood in the ruins of Berlin. And the price of the earlier verdicts, the admiration, the trust, the 80 ignored warnings, was being paid on every front, in numbers no one could yet count, including in a German camp in April 1943 by his own son. Verdict 5. The obsession, and 2 bloodlines that erased themselves. One last myth, and this is the one that spawned 1,000 conspiracy theories. People still ask whether Hitler really died in that bunker, whether he escaped to Argentina, to Spain, to a submarine, and most people assume those rumors started with fringe writers, or novelists, or people who simply couldn't accept a quiet ending. They didn't. They started with Joseph Stalin, personally, deliberately. Here is the sequence, and it is genuinely extraordinary. By early May 1945, Soviet forces held Berlin. Soviet counterintelligence recovered charred remains from the Chancellery Garden. Soviet doctors performed the autopsy. Soviet investigators tracked down Hitler's dental assistant and his dental technician, who separately identified the jaw and bridgework as Hitler's self. A young Soviet interpreter, Elena Rezhkovskaya, was handed a small box containing the teeth and told she was answerable for it with her life. In other words, Stalin had proof, physical, forensic, corroborated proof in his own hands within days. And then he stood in front of the world and said the opposite. At the Potsdam Conference in July 1945, Stalin told the Western Allies that Hitler had probably escaped, dissecting Spain or Argentina. Soviet officials seeded the rumors further, and behind the scenes he ordered his own secret investigation into what had happened in the bunker. Its code name tells you everything about the cynicism involved. Operation Myth. So why lie about a fact he already possessed? 3 reasons, and each one is pure Stalin. First, an escaped Hitler let him imply that the Western Allies were somehow complicit in the escape, a useful accusation as the Cold War began forming. Second, an uncertain Hitler kept Germany unsettled and gave the Soviets a reason to keep hunting, searching, controlling. And third, the deepest one, Stalin could not accept the clean ending for his enemy. Hitler dying quietly, on his own terms by his own hand, was a victory Hitler had awarded himself. Keeping him theoretically alive denied him that exit. But underneath all 3 sits something simpler and more human. Stalin had been fooled by Hitler exactly once, in June 1941, and it had nearly destroyed his country. He had built his entire life on never being caught out again. So when handed the news that his enemy was conveniently dead, and the evidence conveniently burned, the old machinery kicked in. He would not be fooled twice, even by the truth. That was Stalin's final verdict on Adolf Hitler. Not hatred anymore. Suspicion. Permanent, unresolvable suspicion. Extended beyond the grave. He hunted a dead man, because he could no longer trust anything connected to that name, including a corpse in a box. And then there were the children. Because here is where the 2 dictators' stories finally rhyme, in a way neither of them could have imagined. Look at Stalin's family. His eldest son, Yakov, was dead in a German camp. His second son, Vasily, was made an Air Force general in his 20s, purely on the strength of his surname, and it destroyed him. He was a heavy drinker for most of his adult life. After his father died in 1953, the protection vanished, and Vasily was arrested and imprisoned by the state his father had built. He died in 1962, aged 41, a general, a Stalin, dead of the bottle, in obscurity. And then there was Svetlana, Stalin's daughter. The one child he showed genuine affection for, grew up as the closest thing the Soviet Union had to a princess. And she spent the rest of her life running from it. In 1967, on a trip to India, Svetlana Aliyeva walked into the United States Embassy in New Delhi and defected. It was a global sensation. She arrived in America and published a memoir describing her father honestly, and she made her position on him unmistakable. Years later, when she renounced her Soviet citizenship, she reportedly burned her Soviet passport. She married an American, took his surname, and became Lana Peters, a name with no history attached to it at all. She moved constantly, lived modestly, and in her final years spoke about her inheritance with brutal clarity, that wherever she went, whatever she did, she would always be a political prisoner of her father's name. Lana Peters died in Wisconsin in 2011, aged 85. The daughter of the man who ruled a third of the world died in a small American town, under a borrowed name. Now look at the other family, the one on the opposite side of the war. Hitler's sister Paula outlived him, and for much of her adult life, on her brother's own instruction, she lived under a different surname, Wolf. After the war, she spent her final years quietly in Austria, avoiding attention entirely. And then his nephew, William Patrick Hitler, born in Liverpool to Hitler's half-brother and an Irish mother, emigrated to the United States, and in 1944 did something almost beyond belief. He joined the United States Navy and served in the armed forces fighting his own uncle's regime. When the war was over, he settled quietly on Long Island, and he changed the family surname to Stuart Hostin. His sons carried that name, and the family made a choice, reported for decades, that closes this story with terrible symmetry. The line would end with them. No children, no continuation. The surname retired, deliberately, forever. So hold the final image. 2 of the most powerful men of the 20th century. 2 men who bent history around themselves, who commanded tens of millions, whose faces were on every wall in their countries. And their blood ends in the same place, hiding. A daughter in Wisconsin, as Lana Peters. A sister in Austria, as Frau Wolf. A nephew on Long Island, as Stuart Houston, wearing an American uniform, against his own uncle. Both bloodlines survived by ceasing to be themselves. So, what did Stalin really think of Hitler? He looked across Europe and saw a mirror. He admired it, trusted it, and was destroyed by trusting it. Every verdict in this story flows from that one error. He assumed Hitler calculated like Stalin, and so he could not imagine Hitler doing something Stalin would never do. The only human being he ever chose to believe was Adolf Hitler. And Hitler was the one man on earth who had already proven, in public, to everyone, that he would never keep his word. That is the cost of trusting a reflection. It is also why the children of both men spent their lives dismantling what their fathers built. Not the empires, those fell on their own, but the names. Their children didn't choose the fathers, they only inherited the names. And both families answered the same way. They disappeared. What does it say about a legacy when the safest thing your own blood can do is stop being you?